So we spent some time talking about document design, and that's one important element when we talk about the visual appeal of a technical deliverable and whether or not it's designed to be read in a variety of different ways: scanned, skimmed, reference, as well as critical engagement and extensive or intensive reading. But that is one element among many. The other thing that you have to consider is how can you offer readers that have other learning styles or auditors that have another way of appreciating information, how can you help them understand what you're trying to present? And that's where this idea of purposeful graphics comes in. It's important to think about not just the way you show the hierarchy of information through heading, through column use, through whatever else, but also consider how you present information visually in the graphics that are ubiquitous when we talk about technical documents. So, one of the things that's important for the collaborative research report and important for your final technical report is to know when and how to use effective graphics. Now, when we talk about graphic design, we are talking about documents, document design and the appeal of your document, but it is a reader decision with genre characteristics and grammatical norms, visuals of all kinds, whether that's an image that you use, like a snapshot or a screen grab, or something that you design, like a table or a bar graph or whatever else. These are all elements that are also important and distinct from the document, the report itself, because it's its own rhetorical situation. It's embedded in the report itself, but there are other things you have to think about when you're talking about the stylistic approach of, or the genre of, or the design of a graphic. And grammar might come into play in the way that you set up, and describe the key to a graph, or the way that you label the graph. But for the most part, you're talking about graphical norms that serve the function of grammatical norms. Okay? And I'm not going to go into each and every different type of graphic and understanding the different subgenres themselves, but it's important to think about these things as separate rhetorical documents, as separate things where you have the same auditor, but you have a much more focused amount of content and a much more specific exigence that's tied to the report and other things like that. So when we say a well-designed document makes a good impression and reveals the structure and hierarchical organization of the information, it also guides auditors to relevant information, whether through the use of headings or in terms of graphics, through the use of graphics. It points out this is something important I want you to pay attention to. These are significant results. These are significant takeaways. This is what you need to pay attention to. Graphics highlight these things in a way that typing it out doesn't always do. So you want to take the time to develop good graphics that not only guide auditors to relevant information, but enhance information retention and auditor efficiency. So enhance their ability to keep the information in their head or reference back to it. We all know that from reading different documents in our own fields that if you come across an image, it's easier to keep in mind what that image was and what they're trying to get out, or what they're trying to communicate with that, than it is what the text is, or the specifics of that image versus the specifics of the text. And that's just the nature of it. So you got to build your documents with that in mind. You don't want to overwhelm them with too many images or too many graphics, okay, because you're trying to guide them to relevant information. And if you do it well, then you are enhancing information retention and auditor efficiency. So when we talk about this idea of ethos, pathos, logos, which you may remember from earlier this class, one thing that is clear about graphics is that while there is logos, one of the things that graphics allow a quick snapshot of that is not as easy for you to present in text is the pathos or importance of a document, or the urgency of it, or whatever else. And that's something that comes with visual rhetoric. It's much easier in visual rhetoric to convey pathos than it is to convey ethos or logos. Okay, it is easy in a visual document, if someone's aware and critically analyzing it, to hurt your ethos. And there is logos involved, but for the most part, pathos is at the center of visual rhetoric in a way that's not as consistent in text. All right. So, when you're putting together a graphic, okay, whether that's a table or a chart or a graph or a map or whatever else, you want to make sure to be purposeful in your choice of a graphic. Okay, what kind of graph am I using? Am I using a bar graph or a line graph? Why am I using a pie chart instead of a percentile bar graph? Why am I using a checklist instead of bullet points in the text? Why am I putting a graphic in this document at this point? Okay, so you want to be very clear on the exigence for that graphic. In other words, what is the problem that this graphic is helping you solve? Is it helping you communicate something easier than it would be to write it all out? Or is this an opportunity to emphasize something? So is it a problem or opportunity? Exigence. Okay? And then how can you conform to genre purposes for this? So don't just include graphics because they're required. Include them for a purpose. Okay? Make sure to present a concise and clear visual. Okay? Don't let it span too much material, and make sure that there not only is there a reason for it to be there, the purpose, the exigence, but that you are communicating a very specific thing through this visual. Right? Hopefully that that specific thing is tied to the rest of the report, but you want to think about, okay, what's the message of this graphic? And then restrict the content to a manageable amount of information. Don't try to do too much. If you want to present multiple graphics, that's okay, as long as you have a purpose behind each of those graphics. But that's better than trying to force way too much into one infographic or one graphic in general. Right. Make sure also to choose the appropriate format and conform to genre conventions. Okay, and clearly frame the graphic and label the included elements. We'll talk about this specifically. Framing the graphic is something that a lot of technical communicators struggle with when they first start out, and that they just want to just put the graphic there and let it speak for itself, but you got to introduce it and you got to label it. All right. So, planning for a graphic. You want to think about how will the auditor react to the content, okay? What's in there? So are you trying to highlight important information or show an overall trend? Are you trying to put it in context with other things? What rhetorical exigence underlies the graphic, okay, or the content that's being highlighted in the graphic? So why? Why are you putting this graphic in? Is there something that you're trying to emphasize? Is there something that you're trying to... Is there a problem with how you're writing something? You think a graphic will help you talk about it? Okay? This is important. A lot of people just put in graphics. They put in images just for the heck of it. But there's a reason to have this in there. For instance, in my syllabus, I have a banner image that was carefully selected because it focuses on composition, on writing, but it also allows me to point to the more fine-grained, purposeful decisions that are part of technical communication that are not always part of academic writing. So what information are you stressing? Why is that there? And then what constraints limit the graphics production? All right. Yeah, there's the time element. It takes a lot of time to do these types of things. For instance, these PowerPoint presentations. I have built them over years, but I still will spend an hour or more every week trying to fine tune so that things come across clearer this time around than they did last time around. So, how much time do you have to do this? What kind of equipment is available? Okay, do you have a good camera that you can easily use those images? Do you have Photoshop or something else that allows you to modify images effectively? Do you have a good program to build graphics that are more effective? And then, hopefully not for this class, but in general, how much money or expertise can be devoted to the graphic? If you have an important document, then more often than not, you will have a designer whose sole purpose is translating crude graphics into effective ones, right? I know I have friends that work in marketing, and they constantly refer back to the fact that they have a developer on retainer, and they have to get things off to them with a clear set of goals, and then there's a back and forth revision process to make sure that those graphics are as effective as possible. All right, so if we talk about this in terms of the visual rhetoric, you're trying to make sure that the auditor understands the content, right? That's the goal of this, first and foremost. I mean, that's the goal of technical writing, okay? But we need to have a clear understanding of what the exigence is behind the document, what the constraints are limiting the document, and what you, to go back to this, what you are hoping to do with this information. It's not all just like, I need to put a graph in here. It's about the right time, or that's what typically goes in the results section. Why this graph? Why this design? Okay. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go into all of this. You can see some of my annotations. But just know that there are very specific reasons to choose the kinds of graphs that you do. Okay. And then each of these has its own like subgenre. So do you have an excise pie chart that takes out one of the slices to highlight it? Or do you want to use a line graph with shaded area? Or do you want to use a compound bar graph or a bar line graph combination? Why am I doing each of these things? That's something to consider as you make choices about what's the purpose of the graphic and what am I trying to highlight. It's going to change which kind of genre you need to lean on, the constraints that bind that genre, but also, you know, what are the expectations that go along with that? So, for instance, if I see an organization chart, I have certain expectations about why that org chart is in there. If you include an org chart in the middle of a section on, you know, the procedures in a lab, then I might assume that you're about to go into detail about who did what, as opposed to using a flow chart, which tells me like, okay, this is how this went, right? So, you know, do I have a table with check marks that's very graphically oriented, or do I have a table that's more data oriented and is just trying to present information? So what am I trying to offer here? Okay. So just as a clear example, there's a big difference between using different things. So a photograph, for instance, or a screenshot, okay, these are instantaneous examples of what happened at this moment. All right, they're precise, they're concise, they are tied to a specific rhetorical situation. If I'm taking a photograph, I'm trying to show you what happened at this site at this moment, right? I am not trying to show you, you know, trends or anything like that. For that, what communicates that better is a simplified representation. So either a line drawing or a map. Those allow for a greater sense of, okay, this is overall what's going on, right? This allows me to see the bigger picture, the forest for the trees. The photograph, I will focus in, even if the reader doesn't hope that I will, on specific details, right? So for instance, in this photograph, I don't care about the clouds, I care about what the planes are doing. In this screenshot, I'm looking at specifically this box, And so what you want to think about is, do I want attention on a specific element, and how do I highlight that element through modifying the image? Or do I want to pay attention to a larger thing, in which case maybe I should use a line drawing or a map or something along those lines. In general, the genres that you choose for your graphics fall into these kinds of relationships. So you have numerical information that's typically in tables, bar graphs, line graphs, pie charts, and again, you can see the different kinds: deviation bar graphs, stratum bar graphs. Okay, if you've never thought about this, well, you may want to start. But like a deviation bar graph is the ones that have plus and minus, right? Stratum has different levels within a single bar. Okay, do you have compound line graphs, or do you have basic line graphs? Do you have cutout, is what I was talking about with the excised section. Do you have screenshots, array shots, line drawings? Okay, phantom, cutaway, exploded, right? These are all different ways to represent machines, but if I use an exploded view, I'm trying to say something specific as opposed to a cutaway view, right? This tends to be more procedural. This tends to be more looking at the different parts included, right? So thinking about these things and why you would choose one or the other goes back to that whole point of have a purpose, understand why you're using this graphic in this moment in the report. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but in general, if you follow the genre constraints and the conventions, then you will do this. But if you're putting together an infographic or a graphic wholesale, you want to think about these 4 basic principles. One is proximity. Keep like information with like. If you do the XY axis on a chart, then that's going to force you to keep like with like proximity-wise, right? But other kinds of graphical formats might require you to play with this a little bit. Alignment, okay, so that you are forcing consideration of the same material the same way. So the here the graphics are aligned so that this is a visual cue as to what the will be talked about, but the information on the right is also aligned, so that if I'm just reading for what's going on here, then that information is lined up so that as I'm reading left to right, top down, I have a clear sense of what's going on. There's a repetition in the type of information and a repetition in the way that information is laid out. And this is where parallelism comes in handy, if you remember that from Pinker. You also have contrast. Okay, contrast is just a visual representation of information through contrasting colors. So you can see how these kinds of things come into play in other ways. So we have proximity of the types of information in this infographic put together into these 3 sections. Okay, alignment, where all the information is lined up on the right-hand margin of the map or the left-hand margin of the map, so we have a clear understanding of where to look for information. If there were also, like, if the London flag was pointed here, then that would lead to some visual confusion and not look as good, right? And so not be presented as clearly for the auditor. Repetition. So we have these. This is one whole section we can tell, right? Even before I start putting boxes on it. But you also have this repetition of simple iconography, but also of information as you go down, and it offers clear comparison, right? That's the point of repetition, is it offers clear comparison between different things without other things getting in the way. All right. You can see these things as well. So here's a bad example of this sort of stuff, but we still these are not great graphics from an earlier CRR from a couple years ago, but you can see even they just use the standard from Excel, and it offers contrast, it offers alignment, it offers proximity, it does everything that it's supposed to do in terms of the basics, but you can refine it and make it a little bit easier. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is just the need for a useful color palette. And you want to pay attention to a lot of things when you're talking about the color palette. Limit functional color choice to 3 to 4 per graphic. If you're using, obviously, screenshots or photographs, it's not possible. But anything else, 3 to 4 per graphic. When I was in high school, I once had a rather sadistic high school teacher whose final for my geography class was to freehand draw a map of the world. We had like 4 days to do it, but every day we'd come into class and we'd have a poster board in front of us and we'd have to freehand draw a map of the world. Now, I know a lot about how the world's laid out thanks to that, but it was kind of tough. Either way, that's the point when we come to color palette. If you're talking about color palette, one of the things that the teacher said was you're allowed 2 pencils and 4 colored pencils. That's all we were allowed, and then we had to color in the countries so that no 2 colors touched. Well, that's even with all the countries in the world and the way it's laid out, it's still possible with only 4 colors to get the entirety of the world drawn in a Mercator map. So this is true of most graphics. You are hardly ever going to need to use more than 4 colors per page. I mean, even look here. I have 5, right? Purple, orange, blue, gray, red, and green to brown. But this is functionally its own color. And so even though this is a complicated page, there's still 3 to 4 functional colors per graphic. Okay? And then use color to reveal a pattern. Try to reveal patterns through the use of color. Okay? And utilize symbolic meaning when developing a graphic so that you have a sense of, okay, what's going on. So I'll just give you a sense of what I mean by this. Now, this is the rhetorical situation visualized for you. Here I have different color choices that reveal symbolic meaning. Okay? So the auditor is the foundation, so I'm going to use a darker color so it's constantly bringing attention to it. All right. Constraints are a red line, things that you need to pay attention to, but also things that are like a stopping point. So that's why I color this constraints red in this graphic. And while there are more than 4 colors here, whenever I'm talking about this, I bring and I highlight at most 4 things, right? Redder content auditor or constraints and context. And so what I'm trying to say is you need to think about these things so that you don't overwhelm your auditor and so that you can bring attention to the purpose for the graphic. Because if you have too many colors, then that distracts, just like with a badly designed document. And if you have too little appreciation for the symbolic meaning of a color, then you lose meaning. And if you, so anyways, I could go on and on, but that's important to think about. You also want to, and I'll just say this now, this is why it's important to have a color palette, right? If you look back at all the PowerPoint presentations from this course, you will notice that if I am talking about the Redor or the Redor-related information, stuff that is your decision, right? Or ethos is Redor-related, I use orange. Every time I use orange for the Redor. I use black for the auditor. I use brown for the context. I use green for the rhetorical situation. And so thinking about these things and having consistency across the document makes it easier for the auditor to follow along. Okay? So, for instance, color is a contextual influence on your paper. It's not going to influence the kind of information that you have. It's not going to influence the way you present it for the auditor. Well, it influences that, but it's not going to change what you emphasize for rhetorical purpose. But it will influence the auditor in how they understand it. So that's a contextual thing to consider. Useful color palette is central to a good rhetorical situation, but fades into context. So that's why I use this kind of color palette. You can think about that and think about strategic choices. Or you could just say, we're going to prioritize these 3 colors, and that in its own right, will start to develop patterns, right? Which is how my color palette ended up. I said, okay, I want to prioritize this color, this color, and this color. And so I just kind of built out from there when I was developing this. Either way, when we talk about this, when we talk about color, we're talking about context. We're talking about the stuff that's kind of in the background. But you need to pay attention to it. All right? So here's an example of what we're talking about. This is from your textbook, okay? You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors, okay? Now, that's one more than is what they recommend, but it's still pretty evident of, okay, here's what we're focusing on. And you can see some of those colors aren't common throughout, so I'm using it more to highlight certain features. I also have the one thing that's common to all of these stomachs is the corpus or fundus, right? And so that's the one that I'm probably going to highlight in my discussion. So I am going to color that red as the most visually obvious color, right? But I might also include, okay, the esophagus. I'm going to color it this color for strategic reasons. I'm going to color the I just lost track of what that was called, and I must have cut out here, but the purple. Okay, so we have a sense of the color palette, and we're using specific colors to highlight different things and highlight a trend and show a pattern. All right. Because I've gone on for a while, I'm not going to go into this, but I might encourage you to think about what information is being stressed with this graphic format. Does it follow the best practices of design in terms of its genre, but also in terms of color palette? And is there a rationale behind the choices? Okay. Here we can see specifically we're highlighting the Marines. Why? I can tell you that. Easy enough. It's in red. Okay. This is a more neutral color, and so this is supposed to fade into the background so that you're paying specific attention to the Marine Corps, right, and its relationship to the rest of the Navy. You might also think about, okay, well, why did they choose this mustard color instead of a color more affiliated with the Navy? Well, they don't want you to think about the Navy as much as they want you to think about the Marine Corps, so they're going to focus on this, okay? Also, what information is being stressed? Well, this. I know that in terms of color. I also know that in terms of the way that the org chart is weighted, okay? So here, this is down below. This is middle ranked, okay? So these guys have priority over this. Like, you can think about this in strategic ways and how they highlighted this. Now, I will say, if you just use like a smart graphic, it's not going to allow you to do this kind of thing, so you got to play around with it a little bit. All right. The last thing I want to mention, you need to clearly frame the graphic and label the included elements. And the reason that I'm highlighting this is because a lot of students will just put in the graphic and not do anything with it. But you need to think, why is it there, and what am I hoping to do with it? And those two things go together. And if you're thinking about why it's there and what you're hoping to do with it, then you need to frame the graphic and give us reason to look at it and appropriately label it. So first and foremost, place the graphic in a proximal location. Put it where it's supposed to be, next to the information that's important. I don't know how many reports have been ruined by having a makeshift appendix, or how many reports have been ruined with a makeshift appendix where they just put all of their graphics at the end. That is never what you want to do, because that does not allow the auditor to use the graphic in the document to highlight or understand information, which is usually what the purpose of a graphic is, to either highlight information or to understand information. And if you move all the stuff to the end of the report, or put all of it in the middle of the report without being clear about what goes with what, then you are not helping the auditor understand information or helping highlight important information that's critical for where the graphics exigence was placed. So where the problem or opportunity came up. That's what I mean by proximal. Put it where in the text or in the report the problem or opportunity first originated that made you want to write or put together this graphic. Okay? Introduce the graphic in the text. Make sure to introduce it in the text. Okay? While most people will scan and see a graphic before they ever come close to seeing it in the text, when you mention it in the text, it tells me, okay, this is why this graphic is here. This is what I'm talking about. This is where I need to look and pay more attention to what the graphic is doing. Typically, when you introduce the graphic in the text, you're saying like in figure 1 or in table 1, right? And that's just a way to refer to it. Table 2, table 3, table 4. But you can decide how you want to do it depending on what's common in your field or what your style sheet says. All right. Then explain the relevance of the graphic. You don't just want to introduce it, but like, as you can see in figure 1, blah, 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 right? As you can see in figure 1, this is a significant finding in comparison with other findings in other fields. Or as you can see in figure 1, this screenshot or this error message leads to critical errors in the program or whatever else, right? So you are pointing out why that graphic is there after introducing it, and then make the graphic visibly distinct. Make sure you can see it and understand why it's there. Put a box around it if you need to. Make sure that it is on the page where it needs to be and that it is visibly distinct. And then make the graphic accessible. Right? So that means you may need to put in a description of what is there for the visually impaired, but it also means that if you're using information that you're citing, that you are making that information accessible. Right? So we talked about credible support a while ago. Same basic idea. Introduce. Integrate. Okay. Make it visibly distinct. That's basically the equivalent. Cite. Make the graphic accessible. State the significance. Explain the relevance. All these things go together. Okay. If you are going to use information that's cited, or that's from another source, cite that information in the caption to your image. If you have an image, most often you're going to have a caption where you make the graphic accessible to those that might not be able to make as much sense of it, or so that you are showing what you're doing, right? If you have questions about this, please let me know. Do not make the mistake of just throwing a graphic in there without having a clear sense of where that information came from and why it's credible. Okay, that's where this idea of citations or relevance are important. And without having a clear understanding of why it's there in the report. Okay, proximal location, introduction. All right, have a clear sense of this and you will do well with graphics. Even if it's not the most visually groundbreaking graphic, it's still a useful graphic if you are placing it in a proximal location, introducing it, explaining the relevance, making it distinct and accessible. All right? Okay. Have a good one. We'll talk about all this stuff in lecture. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much. Take care, and I'll see you in class.